Hi, this is Dr. Tim Green, and I am here with Dr. Michael Molenda, and it is my distinct pleasure to be able to interview Dr. Molenda. And I've known Dr. Molenda, I don't even want to say how long, probably since my first introduction to you, Dr. Molenda, was 1995 when I took my first class from you at Indiana University, and that's where I met Dr. Molenda. So Dr. Molenda now is Emeritus Associate Professor at Indiana University in Instructional Systems Technology. We would be here all day if I listed everything he has done, but the couple things that I want to highlight, one of them was way back in my secondary teaching credential days, and I took a media class, and probably one of my favorite books, and I still have that copy of it still, is Instructional Media and Technology for Learning. That was one of my favorites. And thinking back in those days, Dr. Molenda, I created from that book a flip over overhead projection slide that had multiple layers on it. So it was from that book. So who knew years later that I would end up taking a class from Dr. Molenda at Indiana and actually having Dr. Molenda be my dissertation chair. So welcome, Dr. Molenda.
Thank you, and it was certainly a pleasure to have had you in class and to work with you through your degree. And I learned things from you too, by the way. In fact, I've told other people about the experiences you discussed in working with the teacher training lab at Indiana University. I was impressed with your professionalism and the thoughtfulness you put into that process. And so I learned from you also.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm honored that you did. So we're here to talk about educational technology, a definition with commentary. And if you're in the field of instructional technology and educational technology, there's no doubt you've heard this book. So I've asked Dr. Molenda if he would spend some time talking about that book. And so I have some questions I'm going to ask of him. So I guess the first one is, how did you become involved with this book? I mean, how did it start and how did you become involved with it?
Well, to give a little context, AECT and its predecessor, DAVI, had published previous definitional books, and they had done it roughly once every 10 years. The first one was 1963, then 77, then 94, and it was time for a new one. And I was asked by the president if I would agree to serve on the Definition and Terminology Committee, with the understanding that this committee this year would have the charge of undertaking a new definition book. I agreed very readily because I had had a long-standing kind of guilt feeling about that project. I entered the field in 1963 and grew up with that first book, which was edited by my mentor at Syracuse University, Don Ely. And so I felt close to that project, and because we had a chance to discuss it with him as graduate students. And the 1977 edition, I also was there. I should have contributed more than I did. I chose to step back and let others do it. I just didn't quite feel brave enough to step in. 1994, I felt brave enough to do it. I wanted to do it. I was on the committee, but I was busy with other professional and personal things and didn't really have the time to devote to making a full contribution to that. And so I always felt a little guilty. And so when this came along, I said, yes, now I'm ready. Sure, I have other things to do, but I'm going to give this highest priority. That was actually in 2002. So the process started quite a long time before it ended.
Mm-hmm. So talking about that process, what was the process for developing the current definition that we had? What I know I'm interested in that. I know of others we talk about. How did we arrive at this definition?
Yeah, it's well you ask about the process because that was an important part of a good conclusion. And I give a lot of credit to Al Januszewski, who was chairman of that committee. He really was the one in charge of the process, and I have to say, as laborious as it was, it worked. And the process, in a nutshell, was to have the committee meet face to face at AECT conventions in 2003, 2004, 2005, have some really extended discussions. And I think in 2004, we spent most of that convention in session. People came and went when they had to give presentations, but otherwise that committee was in session pretty much the whole time. And that's when a lot of the work was done. A lot of the negotiation that has to go on for a group to reach consensus, and that was a big part of it, reaching consensus. So not only were we chewing through these issues at the conventions, but we were taking prototypes of the definition itself and giving those to critique at PIDT conferences. I think there were at least two of those in those years where they devoted significant time to debating the concepts and then the statement that we were proposing. And both the concepts that went into the definition were debated, as well as the definition statement itself. That is, we spent a lot of time deciding what elements should go into the definition. And some people were willing to settle pretty quickly for a kind of a superficial definition that wouldn't have differed significantly from the 1994 definition. But there were some of us on the committee who felt that the great flaw of the 1994 definition was that it read like a description of the ISD process, and which included using technical terms from the field to define the field. And we thought that violated one of the principles of a definition of a field, which is to be able to reach out to people outside your field and explain who you are and what you believe in. So the idea, the concepts themselves, the elements, were debated at great length. And then, of course, how those fit together into a coherent statement. And I really pushed one aspect that at the beginning, I think I was the only voice. I picked up allies, but it took time to convince people. I was pushing for the inclusion of values terms in the definition. This is something that had been missing from all the previous definitions, and that I thought was a fatal error when trying to explain yourself to the outside world. Because people on the outside what you want them to do is to agree that you play a useful role in society, that you have something to offer that no one else can do, whether it's cosmetology or structural engineering or whatever it is. There's something you do that society can't get along without. Otherwise, why should people pay attention to you or support you with tax revenues or moral support or anything else? So I argued and argued, and grudgingly, one by one, people came around. And they came around through the window of ethics. There were people on the committee who had a strong commitment to adding ethics to the definition, and people who had been crusading for the profession to pay more attention to ethical issues, realistic, everyday ethical issues, not the kind of abstract pie-in-the-sky things that end up on ethical standards, but really digging down into everyday issues like pirating software and things like that, things that go on every day, and should we be doing this? And so I argued that they were talking about values, and I was talking about values. We might have disagreed on the priority list of values, but they couldn't deny that, for instance, humaneness was a value that ought to be reflected in all the work we do. What we do ought to be humane to learners. It ought to be, life fulfilling for people, not suppressive or depressing or degrading. They couldn't disagree with that. But it had never been in the book before that we believed in humaneness. I argued for terms like efficiency and effectiveness. These words had become kind of taboo to the constructivist types. They thought these words smacked of behaviorism and of controlling people. And I argued and will forever argue that efficiency and effectiveness are humane values, that you are helping learners when you give them an instructional environment that allows them to succeed faster or better than another learning environment designed by an amateur. That's effectiveness. And if you can do it at lower cost than some other bumbler, Henry Petrosky used the example of, he quoted something from an old manual of structural engineering saying, any fool can build a bridge by dumping enough material in a river until people can walk across it. But an engineer can do it efficiently. An engineer can find the right materials, put them in the right order, and perhaps build it at half the time with half the materials with 10 times the strength. Okay, so that's efficiency. And again, when you have time to argue this out, people can't deny that that is a good thing, and it is what we add. It's the value added of our field. It's efficiency and effectiveness. Since the dawn of cheap software, everyone can design instructional materials. Everyone can write handouts. Everyone can make presentations, digital presentations. But they're not efficient and they're not effective. That's the difference between what we do and what amateurs do. So anyway, it was a hard sell, but because we had the time and the face-to-face contact, we were able to get over this and eventually get a consensus behind it. Then it became a process of selling it to the AECT board of directors, where we had to go through the same thing. And the PIDT participants, many of whom walked into the room with the same kind of preconceptions about taboo words. So that's why it took time. But that's why the process was important. I think Al Januszewski did a good job, a good political job of presenting it, listening to objections, responding or inviting others to respond to those objections, and bit by bit building buy-in to the process. So it didn't, one last part about the process. As it happened, I was getting close to retirement as I was writing my chapters. We decided that each committee member would be responsible for one of the chapters. And we decided that we would have one chapter for each of the major terms in the definition. Now, all of that took time to decide what should the book look like, how big should it be, and what should it say. And so we had to thrash that out, but we finally decided on an outline for each chapter that would be parallel to the other chapters, and then they were farmed out to committee members. who could co-author with an expert in the field if they wanted. And as time went by, I was getting into retirement, and chapters were not getting written. Other people's chapters were not getting written. Then I retired, and I volunteered. I said, well, look, this chapter seems to be languishing. I'll take it over and see what you think. I'll send it around. So I did that, and then I did another, and another, and another. And I ended up either authoring or co-authoring or rewriting a great majority of material in those in all the chapters. And I was able to do that because I was retired. And again, it was an opportunity for me to say things I'd been wanting to say all these years, but I never had the platform to say them. All these years, I had considered myself a generalist, someone who kept up to date with all of the elements of the field, expert in none of them, but aware of the literature and the research across the broad spectrum of the field. And that's what I taught at Indiana. I taught in the beginning courses and the ending courses, introducing people to the whole field and then giving a capstone to the whole field. So that's what I was comfortable with. But I never had a chance to put into print things that I knew or believed about administration, about production, and that sort of thing, about learning theory. I'm not an expert in those areas, but I could give a novice introduction, which is what the book is intended to be, better than the experts. And the experts weren't doing their job anyway. They weren't writing. So I volunteered to do it. That's how I became co-editor of Januszewski said, we got to put your name on the cover because you did so much of the work. And then my name is on a lot of the chapters too. That's how all that happened.
So the folks who wrote the chapters, you said they're part of the original, the committee who went through and helped with the discussion of redefining the definition. Did that committee stay pretty cohesive throughout the time, or people drop off, new people came in? How did that work?
It stayed pretty cohesive.
Yeah.
I don't think it had any major changes in the composition of the committee from the beginning to the end.
Yeah. So how did those folks get on that committee?
Same way I did. They were appointed by the president.
Oh, okay.
So these were people that either had been on the committee already, and there were some people who were sort of perennially on the committee, people who had a native interest in definitions and terminology, and others, let's say people who the president thought would give credibility to the report. And it was one thing that helped us was that we were given the task at the very beginning of developing a publishable book. The executive director of AECT had told us that AECT needed to put out a book like this, and it had to be credible, and it had to be of a certain size and scope, and it had to have a certain punch to it, and they really needed it. So we knew we were going to do a book, and so the president was looking for people who had a track record of delivering on writing assignments.
So in thinking about the definition that we have now, and what have you heard or listened to the conversations about major criticisms or disagreements with where we are now with the definition? I think this has been a couple weeks ago, but I'm still on the IT forum listserv, and I'm surprised there's still an email listserv, but it's going strong. And there was at least 2 weeks discussion, and this happens, I swear this happens every year. People debate IT, ET, the definition, where does this all fit? And I find this very interesting. Some people distance themselves from the term educational technology, which I find quite interesting. But from your point of view, what are some of the major criticisms of the definition or the issues with it?
Well, the one you raised certainly was a barrier. We began to debate that issue with some vehemence at our first meeting of the committee, but Al Janiszewski put an end to it. He said, look, you all can discuss this till you're blue in the face, but I'm chairman of the committee. I'm going to edit the book. I'm committed to the term educational technology, and you're not going to change my mind.
Interesting.
So we all looked at you and says, okay, Al, that'll do it. So, yes, you're right. It's a perennial issue. And in fact, the 1977 committee spent an enormous amount of time and chapters in the book talking about the connotations of instructional technology versus educational technology. And they took the position that there were two different concepts, and that instructional technology was a subset of educational technology. And I still remember the terms. They talked about the use of educational resources in circumstances that are purposive and controlled. That is an instructional situation. Education is any other circumstance in which people are aiming to learn, but perhaps are not under controlled circumstances. Like people in a library picking books off a shelf and finding something of interest and pursuing a curiosity they have. No one is guiding them, no one is telling them what to do next or giving them assignments, but they are being educated. So books in the library, DVDs in the library, those are educational resources. When a teacher brings them into the classroom, gives an introduction, plays a portion of the video, asks follow-up questions, that's now an instructional resource. See, that's the distinction they made, and I thought it was perfectly reasonable, and it satisfied my intellectual curiosity, and I bought into it, but I found out I was maybe one of 3 people in the field who read, understood, and bought into that concept. I think most other people either never read it, were too lazy to think it through, or just didn't want to be bothered with making what they thought was a trivial distinction into a distinction. So that's why the 1994 definition had impetus. We've got to change the terminology. We've got to fixate on one term, and at that time the hot term was instructional technology, and so that was the way it was phrased in 1994. So when it came to us, we had all of this background of previous fights over this, and Al said, you can argue, and he sees himself as a philosopher, and he studies philosophy and he thinks philosophically, and he said, I guarantee you that any philosopher and I could argue persuasively that either education or instruction is the broader term that encompasses the other. I guarantee you I can convince you of one, then I can convince you of the other. So there is no inherent reason to privilege one over the other. And he says, in fact, in the field, these terms are used interchangeably. And we're not going to change people's behavior. They're going to continue to use them interchangeably. Whatever suits their local need or interest, they're going to use that term. We found an interesting example of that in IST. Back in the mid-90s, a program was developing at IUPUI, the Indianapolis campus of Indiana University, and they wanted to offer a master's degree, offering courses of pretty much our standard courses, but they didn't want us to be part of the approval process. They didn't want IST Bloomington to be part of the approval process. They sent it another route, through the teacher education program, and but it came to our attention, and they said, well, this has nothing to do with you. You're instructional systems technology. We're educational technology. We're about using technology in schools with teachers and things like that. You have nothing to do with that. So in their mind, educational technology was a completely different animal than IST. So, people argue every which way on those terms. So we decided to ignore the difference, say they were interchangeable, and just get on with the job. But that certainly is something that has to be discussed and sold and rediscussed with every new group of discussants.
Do you think this is a healthy debate that we have this every year?
Well, it would be healthy if people were as precise in their thinking as that 1977 group was, where they defined exactly what they meant as the distinction between the two, and drew a clear line and showed a Venn diagram of how they fit together. If people would do that, then it's a healthy discussion. But usually they say, no, education is better, no, instruction is better.
Yeah, I remember that Venn diagram from our 511. That is one of my biggest memories. We had that discussion in our class, and you went to the whiteboard, and you drew that and made that clear distinction, and that still sticks out of my mind when people say, oh, these terms are interchangeable, it's instructional. And I go back, well, what did Dr. Molenda say about it?
Yeah.
And that always comes to my mind.
For some people, the precise meaning of words is important. Other people think that's pedantry and, academic airs. But I'll go to my grave believing that words should have meaning.
Exactly. So, considering the book, it deals with a lot of what I think are perennial issues in our field, because you mentioned administration, production. Which of these issues have you found over time seem to cause the most debate or disagreement within our field? Is there a couple of them that jump out?
Sure. The easy one is talking about facilitating learning, that phrase. In fact, I think the committee was most fearful of approaching that topic because at that time, the constructivist movement was very dominant and was very vocal. And I would even say kind of intolerant of other positions. So when we came to that, how do we talk about learning? Learning has to fit somewhere into the definition. And how are we going to phrase that? And I proposed, after a good deal of discussion, I proposed teaming me with Rhonda Robinson. Rhonda was probably widely recognized at that time, and certainly in AECT circles, as the biggest proponent of constructivism. Okay, and I was, for those who knew anything about me, which is probably very few, but those who knew me knew that I was somewhat skeptical about what this thing meant, because it clearly means many different things. But I was willing to say that and confront it and force a discussion of it. And Rhonda, even though we were professional friends, and she's an Indiana graduate, we'd never had any kind of personal animosity. She considered me her biggest rival for how this term was going to be used in the book. So I said, why don't you put us together, let us thrash it out. If we can thrash it out, surely what we come up with will be marketable to the rest of the field. And so we did, and we went back and forth on the phone and by email and sending drafts, and we finally came to a position that she could agree with. Let's put it this way, she couldn't disagree with it. What I was saying was true. And she couldn't disagree with it anymore without looking foolish. And so what is in that chapter is the compromise we came up with, and it's something I'm very happy with, and I think is a reflection of reality and not just fantasy, which is what a lot of what was at that time the rhetoric around constructivism. Pretty fanciful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. And going back down memory lane, it's another conversation I remember having in one of your classes, R711, when we, towards the end of our program, talking about behaviorism, constructivists, and cognitivists, all of that, and how it all fits together. And I remember having some good-spirited conversations in the class about that. So the last question I ask everyone I interview is advice. And so I'm going to ask that of you too, Dr. Molenda. What advice do you have for those starting out in our field? What wisdom can you pass along?
Well, I'm not hesitant to answer, because even though I haven't been paying attention to the professional literature for several years, and I don't know exactly what your students are learning or what challenges they face, but I still feel confident in giving some advice, because it's the same advice I would have given 40 years ago and will give 40 years from now if I'm still alive. And that is, pay attention to and develop skills related to the perennial issues. In our field, the most central issue is facilitating learning. Our job is to help people learn. So we have to understand the process of learning, not understand it like a neuroscientist, but understand it as a technologist, someone who takes the scientific understanding and adapts it to practical reality. How can we treat this material now that we understand it? So using what we understand about human learning. And human learning hasn't changed. The brain has not evolved significantly in the last 20 years since computers were developed. That has not changed the physiology of the brain. Despite what people think, and despite what people, jump to as like ability to multitask or digital natives who think differently, they do not think differently. They may handle technological objects and technological processes differently than people who grew up with different technologies, clearly. But that doesn't change the human brain. And I'll until I see convincing evidence to the contrary, I'm sticking with that. So you can't go wrong by studying human learning. And of course, what we know about learning and what we know about cognitive processes is advancing pretty rapidly these days. So we have to find credible sources and stick close to them and make sure we're listening and keeping up with developments. Having some understanding of human learning, and then having some understanding of information design or message design. How can you craft messages that attract attention, that hold interest, that reduce distraction, that focus attention on the important things? That's information design. And that's something we should know how to do, because amateurs don't know how to do it. They don't know how to facilitate learning, and they don't know information design. So those are skills, and then there are work processes that we have that amateurs don't have. I'm thinking of the kind of systematic approach to problem solving that we have. Flawed though it may be, modifiable though it ought to be, and customizable as it can be, still there is something to say for having a thought-out work process as you approach a problem. And we have that, and amateurs don't. Our work processes incorporate the values of efficiency, effectiveness, and humaneness, and others don't necessarily. We can do the job faster, better, and cheaper. if we use efficient, effective work processes. So those work processes and those kind of perennial principles give us tools that other people don't have. So I haven't mentioned anything about computers or technology because those keep changing.
Right.
And in fact, will disappear or be transparent or will appear in a different form pretty soon, at some point in the future. Who knows, maybe the satellites could all crash and we would lose the World Wide Web. But that wouldn't put us out of business because people still need those who understand how to create learning environments efficiently and effectively and humanely. So that's my advice. Stick to the perennial principles, become very good at those skills, and you'll be valuable regardless of what happens to technological trends and fads that come and go.
Excellent. Great advice. Thank you, Dr. Molenda, for your time. It was a pleasure being able to talk with you, and I know people are going to enjoy what you had to say. So thank you again.
It's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Tim, and it's always a pleasure to be asked for my opinion. Thank you.
Isn't it?
I am still a professor.
Exactly.
You know the
Dr.
feeling.
Molenda.
Okay.